Welcome to Twilight Fables, where the stories you thought you knew take a darker path. Tonight, we begin the tale of the boy who cried wolf, the moor in the hills, a twisted retelling of a shepherd's lie that summoned something far worse than wolves, a tale where deceit becomes a curse, and the hills listen when you scream. They said the hills behind the village of Mallowedge were ancient, older than the roads, older than the stones in the church walls, older even than the stories the elders whispered when they thought children weren't listening. They sloped gently at first, like the soft curve of a sleeping beast, but farther in, where the trees thickened and sunlight grew unsure, the earth became sharp and jagged, a place where birds refused to sing and wind carried strange echoes. Thorn was 10 the first time he lied. It wasn't a malicious lie, not yet. It was a boy's impulse, born of boredom and mischief, delivered with the wide-eyed dramatics of someone too young to understand the weight of their words. "Wolves!" he had shouted, bursting into the village square, breathless and wild-eyed. "They're coming down the hills!" The blacksmith dropped his hammer. The baker clutched her apron. The reeve gathered a handful of men and their pitchforks, and they ran past Thorn, demanding details. He pointed and nodded and stammered, enjoying the sudden power of his voice. When no wolves were found, and no tracks marked the soil, Thorn shrugged, laughed and said, "Must have scared 'em off." The villagers were less amused. That night, his mother beat the lie out of him with a wooden spoon and shame. "You'll damn us all," she hissed. "You never cry wolf unless it's real. Never speak what isn't true on those hills, Thorn." But the next week, he did it again. This time, he made it more elaborate. He added howls in the wind, claimed he saw glowing eyes just beyond the pine grove, swore the sheep had scattered. Again, the villagers came. Again, they found nothing. Thorn was whipped, this time by the reeve himself. "You little bastard," he said, his breath sour with ale. "We'll leave you out there next time and see what comes for you." Thorn didn't cry. He smiled, lips cracked, because for a moment they'd all looked at him, listened to him, believed. He began to relish the attention. His stories grew, more detail, more panic, more blood. He'd smear lamb's blood on his hands and shirt, tear his clothes, throw himself in front of the sheep pen, and wail like he'd survived something monstrous. It was a game, and he was winning, until the night he saw the hole. It wasn't large, maybe 2 feet wide, hidden between 2 crooked pine trees at the edge of the north ridge. The dirt around it was moist and dark, and it breathed, not fast, not loud, but enough to ruffle the leaves. In, out. Thorn leaned in, thinking perhaps it was some burrow, badger, maybe, or fox. Then it whispered his name, not like wind, not like his own thoughts, a true voice. "Thorn!" He ran, of course. No performance this time, No blood smeared on his arms, no screams or theatrics, just white-faced, wide-eyed flight, all the way down the slope and through the briar paths until he reached the safety of torchlight and houses with locked doors. He didn't tell anyone, because if he did, they might stop listening for the wolves, and then the game would be over. But the dreams began that night. At first, they were vague, a silhouette in the trees, a shape in the fog. But soon they sharpened. In his sleep, he stood again by the hole, staring down into it. Something shifted in the dark, coiled and waiting, something immense. Rows of teeth, eyes that blinked sideways. It said, "Speak again, boy, call me true." He awoke, screaming. Thorn, stop crying. Wolf for 2 whole weeks. His mother said he'd matured. The reeve said a boy's bruises were often better teachers than books. The villagers let their guard down. Sheep returned to the meadows. Laughter returned to the tavern. But Thorn couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He began visiting the hole in daylight, thinking perhaps it had been a dream. He marked its place with stones. He whispered into it. No answer came. Until one afternoon, as rain began to spit and the clouds thickened like bruises, he knelt beside the hole and said, "There are wolves again, real ones." He didn't mean it. He meant to test, to see if the whisper would return. The wind answered, "Then I will come." The hole widened, the soil cracked, buckled and sagged inward as though the earth beneath it had been hollowed. Thorn screamed and fell backward, landing hard on a root. A deep, wet exhalation rolled from below, and a smell like old meat and moss pushed up from the crevice. He ran. This time he didn't go to the village. He hid in the sheepfold, shaking, covering his ears. The sheep were quiet, too quiet. Thorn peeked through the slats of the wooden fence, and his breath caught. Something moved on the hill, enormous, slow, gliding as though swimming through the fog. A ripple of limbs, not quite legs, not quite tendrils. Its body was covered in pale fur, patchy and matted, but its head, if it had a head, was a gaping vertical slit, like a wound with too many teeth, ringed by eyes that blinked in mismatched rhythms, and it was heading toward the village. That night they did not blame Thorn, because the sheep were torn apart, because claw marks, too large to be any wolf, raked the ground, because the thing left behind a trail of black slime that killed grass on contact, because no one could explain the low humming that settled into the soil, or why the dogs refused to bark and instead whimpered in corners, eyes white with terror. "It's a beast from the old tales," the elders said. "A punishment," the priest whispered. Thorn sat by the well, numb. He had spoken, and it had listened. Now it wouldn't stop listening. In the weeks that followed, the creature returned. It never came into the village, but its shape loomed on the ridges, Animals disappeared, trees split down the middle, the hills began to change, paths twisted. People swore they heard voices, sometimes mimicking their own. Thorn tried to stay silent, but the whispers in his sleep grew louder. Call me again, feed me lies. He began to understand. It wasn't wolves he'd called. It was something older, something that lived in truth and untruth alike, that fed on stories and belief, something that became what you named. And now it wanted more lies, more attention, more eyes turned toward the hills. It wanted to be known, and Thorn, in his fear and guilt, realized something far worse than any wolf prowling a pen. He had become its mouthpiece, and the moor in the hills was hungry. The next morning, the sheepfold lay in ruin, not just the animals, gone, bones shattered and dragged across the hillside like discarded toys, but the fence, the gate, the very earth had been ripped open and clawed apart. Deep gouges in the dirt formed a spiral, not random, a pattern, a symbol. The reeve stood staring at it, grey-faced, with a cudgel clenched in his weathered hand. No wolf did this, he muttered. No beast we've ever known, said the priest, who had come with a thurible and a book far older than the village's church. Thorn stood a few paces back, his eyes darting not to the ground, but to the tree line above. The fog hung there like an audience, silent and still. It was watching. The moor was always watching now. No one said Thorn's name, but they looked at him. He could feel it in their gazes, the suspicion, the unease. The boy who cried wolf had screamed one time too many, and something had answered, something had come. By evening, the village was holding its first meeting in the long hall. Since before the snow melt, it had once been the place of celebration, spring feasts, marriages, and harvest toasts. Now it was lit by dim torchlight, windows sealed with cloth, the air thick with sweat and fear. Whatever it is, the reeve began, it's hunting the sheep, so we give it the flock. No, said old Mags, the herbalist, her voice brittle but certain. It's not hungry for meat, it's hungry for us. That thing is listening to us. Don't be ridiculous, the blacksmith barked, wiping grime from his hands. It's a wolf, maybe not a kind we know, but it bleeds. I'll see to that if we can draw it down. You'd be the first it chewed apart, Mags hissed. That's no wolf. The room splintered into shouting. What weapons they had, where the creature came from, what they should call it. That word again. Call. Thorn sat in the back, knees pulled to his chest, rocking slightly. He didn't want to speak. Every time he did, something shifted in the hills. Words had power. His lies had fed it, shaped it, and now it was listening to everyone. Because now they believed, they feared, and that was what the moor wanted. That night it came again. No one saw it, only the aftermath. The schoolhouse roof was peeled off like the lid of a tin box. The walls were smeared with black slime. The teacher was gone. Her glasses remained folded and placed neatly on her desk. That was when the villagers began to whisper the word, more. Not wolf, not beast, more. Thorn knew what that meant. They were naming it, giving it shape, letting it in. Every whisper of the more was like a brick added to its body, a rib, a claw, a new row of teeth. They were building it. Thorn's mother watched him more closely after that. She didn't strike him like before, didn't scream or curse. She simply stared at night when she thought he was asleep, in the morning when she stirred the thin soup, in the fields when the sky turned yellow with fog. She stared as if trying to see through his skin into whatever wrongness she suspected lived inside him. "Tell me the truth, Thorn," she said on the third day after the schoolhouse. "I don't lie any more," he whispered. "That's not what I asked." But he wouldn't answer because he didn't know how. The lie had become the truth. Or maybe the truth had always been a lie. Maybe he had summoned it. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe it had always been in the hills, waiting for someone foolish enough to speak its name. And maybe Thorn had just been the first open mouth. He went back to the hole. The stones he'd marked it with were gone. No, not gone. Swallowed. The ground around it had widened, the spiral gouges forming a ring. And now it truly breathed, slow, deep, and moist, like a thing asleep but dreaming. Thorn knelt, hands shaking. "You were just a game," he said. "I didn't mean." "You meant everything." The voice was inside his bones. "You made me true." "I take it back," Thorn sobbed. "Please, I won't say anything else. I won't speak. I won't." "Liar," it said with amusement. "You will speak. They all will. I am the story now." And with that, something twitched in the dirt. A tongue, long and white, snaking out from the hole and tasting the air. It didn't strike. It only lingered, waving like a flag. "Say my name again." He fled, but the name, the more, was already blooming like rot in the village. They whispered it now in the tavern, clutched charms, and spoke it beneath their breath. Even the priest had begun referring to the more in his sermons, invoking it with desperation and trembling voice, as if it were a god or a devil. That evening, the first villager went missing, old Mags. They found her herbs scattered in the grass. Her walking stick lay snapped clean in two beside a pine stump. Her hat, always perched at an angle, was torn to ribbons. No blood, no body, only drag marks leading back toward the hole Thorn had once found. The reeve gathered a hunting party, 7 men, armed with torches, blades and flint rifles. They didn't let Thorn come, though he begged. "I have to see it," he pleaded. "I have to know what it is." They didn't listen. They went into the hills before moonrise. Only 2 returned. Their names were Jed and Merrill, and they didn't speak for a full day. When they finally did, it was to describe something that did not move like any creature, something folded and wrong, something that watched them from every angle, even from behind, something that sang in a voice that was Thorn's voice, but twisted and stretched like skin on a drum. Merrill had gouged his own ears to stop hearing it. Jed tried to draw what he saw. He lasted 2 strokes of charcoal before snapping the chalk and vomiting blood. The others swallowed. That night, Thorn dreamt of them, not as men, but as parts. Arms, torsos, heads, all connected by a great red thread, wound into a wheel of flesh that turned slowly in the dark. Their eyes blinked independently, still aware, still watching, and in the centre of it all, a mouth too wide for the skull that held it, a maw, his maw. He awoke screaming. His mother held him down, sobbing. "You did this, didn't you?" she cried. "What did you bring here?" "I didn't mean to," Thorn rasped. "I just wanted to be seen. I just wanted someone to listen." "Well, now it listens," she said, voice hollow, and she left him, packed her satchel, and walked into the fog before dawn, past the last house, into the hills. She did not return. Thorn tried to stay silent. He stuffed rags in his mouth. He wrote instead of speaking. He refused to look anyone in the eye, afraid that doing so would trigger them more, like a puppet waiting for applause. But the more no longer needed him alone. The story had spread. Children whispered it, elders dreamed it, and every time the name was spoken, the thing grew. There were new holes now, more of them, dozens, each one breathing, each one whispering different voices. Some mimicked the lost, some mimicked him. A chorus of lies, a choir of the devoured. The priest finally snapped. He gathered the villagers in the square. "It wants to be heard," he screamed, "so let it listen." And he lit the chapel on fire. He said it was sacrifice. The flames reached high into the fog. Smoke clung low to the ground like wool. The maw came again that night, not to take, to show. It left a body, not of the priest, of Thorn's mother, twisted, folded, eyes sewn shut with veins, her mouth stretched open into a smile too wide for her skull. Inside her mouth were teeth not her own. Thorn didn't speak for 3 days, not a word. He drank water, he ate nothing, and then, on the 4th night, the maw spoke to the entire village. It came from every hole, every cave, every crack in the bark of the oldest trees. It came through the wells and the fires and the stones beneath their homes, a single voice in every direction. Do you see what stories make? The houses shook, the fog thickened, and somewhere high in the hills, something vast began to unfold. A limb, like a cathedral made of bones, a spine with no beginning, a throat that never ended. The maw was rising, and Thorn finally understood what it wanted. Not just lies, not just belief, it wanted faith. And the boy who once cried wolf now knew. He was its prophet. The village bells stopped ringing, not because there was no one to ring them, though fewer hands remained each day, but because the sound no longer reached beyond the rooftops. It was swallowed, muffled, as if the very air had thickened into wool. Words lingered longer than they should, bouncing off walls and vanishing into corners. Even thoughts felt heavier. Mallowedge was shrinking, not in size, but in sound, in spirit. The moor had taken more than sheep and people. It had taken meaning. Language began to warp. People spoke in whispers. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others repeated themselves. Echoes caught in a loop. Thorn noticed it first in Merrill, one of the two who survived the expedition into the hills. He sat outside the tavern, rocking slightly, staring at the burned-out chapel. Every few minutes, he muttered, "They see you, they see you, they see you." Thorn approached him, but Merrill didn't respond, didn't blink, only stared. "They see you, they see you." Thorn knelt down. "Who sees me, Merrill?" The man didn't answer, but from behind Thorn, a voice rose from the fog. "I do." Thorn turned. Nothing there, but he knew. The moor was listening again. The people started building altars. They didn't call them that. They called them watch posts or warning stones. But Thorn recognized the patterns. Spirals made of bone, stacks of stones that whispered when the wind passed through them, offerings of raw meat, dolls with sewn mouths. At first, it was just one or two. Then every house had one. The moor had become more than a threat. It was a god, and gods, Thorn had learned, begin as stories. They're shaped by fear, moulded by belief, born from repetition. He'd repeated the lie until the village couldn't forget it. Now the moor was truth, and he, Thorn, the boy who cried wolf, was its first disciple. He fought it at first, refused to speak, refused to participate. But silence wasn't escape, it was invitation. The moor spoke louder in silence. Each night it visited his dreams, not as the monster from the hills, but as versions of himself, 100 thorns, older, younger, twisted, some with mouths stitched shut, some with gaping maws that stretched down to their chests. They stood in a ring around him and chanted, "Say it again." Sometimes he awoke with dirt under his fingernails, once with mud packed into his ears, another time with a black spiral drawn in ash on his chest. He hadn't done it, but something had. The other children had stopped playing. No more stick fights, no hide and seek in the barn lofts. They gathered in the graveyard now, drawing spirals in the dust, whispering riddles that ended in screams. They spoke only in questions. What has teeth but never eats? What walks without legs and dreams without sleep? What listens louder than God? Thorn watched from a distance. He wanted to stop them. He wanted to shout, "Don't give it more names." But he knew it was too late. On the 7th day, after the chapel burned, the sky cracked open, not with lightning, not with rain, with sound. deep, groaning note like the breaking of mountains. The village shook, trees bent, birds fell from the sky, their bodies whole, but their minds gone, eyes wide, beaks twitching, then silence, and then, from the hills, a single, impossible howl. It echoed across the valley, through the trees, into every well and every wall. Everyone heard it, but only Thorn understood it. You gave me life, now give me purpose. The moor had grown. It was no longer hiding. It wanted to be followed. The reeve tried to leave. He packed a cart, took 2 horses, rode out through the East Pass. He returned 2 hours later, walking behind the empty cart. His eyes were gone, just empty holes, no blood. He smiled. The moor sees for me now, he said. Then he hung himself from the steeple's burned remains. No one cut him down. They left him as a sign. Thorn wandered the village like a ghost, watching it rot from the inside out. The people no longer made plans. They didn't farm. They didn't fix. They didn't dream. They just waited for the moor. Some called it the guardian, others the one who listens. A few, only the mads or the deeply faithful, called it father. Thorn hated them most of all, because they had given it everything, and it still wanted more. He returned to the hole. It had grown, now large enough to swallow a man whole, breathing heavier now, like a beast mid-slumber. Steam rose from its mouth. The air buzzed with something just below hearing. Thorn knelt at its edge. I didn't mean to make you real, he whispered. All meaning is choice, the moor replied. You chose to be heard. I was just a child. Children make the best gods. Thorn trembled. What do you want from me? The earth shifted. A long, slick shape emerged from the hole. Neither hand nor claw. It held a mirror, old, cracked. Thorn looked into it. He didn't see himself. He saw every version of the lie he'd ever told. Each time he'd cried wolf. Each time they'd run. Each time he'd laughed. And behind him, always, the moor, watching, growing, waiting for the final lie, the one he hadn't told yet. Give me your last truth, it said, and I will give you silence. Thorn almost said yes, almost, but something stopped him. A sound, small, familiar, a sheep bleating, weak, alone, from the western ridge. He hadn't heard one in days. He ran, climbed the slope, feet slipping on the moss, pushing through the fog until he found it. A lamb, shaking beside a stone, half covered in ash. He dropped to his knees. It was alive, real, not a dream, not an echo. He touched its wool and felt heat, life, fragility. He held it close, and he remembered. Before the lies, before the moor, before the hunger, there had been a field, and a boy, and sheep. That was all. He carried the lamb back to the village. They stared at him, wide-eyed, silent, reverent. The priest approached. It's an offering, he said. The moor sent it. A test. No. Thorn said, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. It's not for the moor, it's for us. They murmured, whispered, some backed away. The blacksmith stepped forward. It must be given. No, Thorn repeated. He turned and walked toward his house, the lamb tucked in his arms. The villagers didn't stop him. They feared him now, not because of what he had done, but because of what he might do next. Because Thorn, the boy who once cried wolf, was no longer just a liar. He was the one who'd survived the truth, and the more hated truth. That night, the whole screamed, not the howl of before, a scream, human, childlike, 1,000 voices, each one screaming the same name, Thorn. It echoed across the fields, into every window, rattling doors, cracking glass. But Thorn didn't answer. He sat in silence, feeding the lamb from a rag soaked in broth. And the moor, for the first time since it was born, was denied, not defeated, not forgotten, but denied. And that, for a god made of stories, was the greatest wound of all. The next morning, no birds sang. It wasn't just quiet, it was hollow, the kind of silence that pressed on the eardrums like a held breath, a silence so complete it made the smallest noises grotesque, the creak of a door, the crackle of embers, the soft whimper of the lamb in Thorn's arms. And beneath it all, something shifted in the hills, not walked, not slithered, shifted. The ground pulsed now, the earth itself was breathing. Thorn didn't leave his house that day. He'd boarded the door the night before, nailed shutters to the windows, sealed the chimney. It wasn't to keep the moor out, it was to keep the villagers in, because they had come to him. One by one, through the dark, they didn't knock. They whispered through the cracks. Prophet, they said. Saviour. Voice of the moor. He didn't answer. He sat by the hearth, the lamb curled in his lap, one hand stroking its back, the other gripping a dull blade his mother once used for skinning apples. He hadn't used her name in days, was afraid if he did, the moor would twist it, feed on it, make her walk again. Everything spoken was a seed now, and the moor was fertile ground. By nightfall there was a tapping on the wood, not knocking, tapping, like nails, like teeth. Thorn approached the door slowly. Thorn, came a voice from outside. Merrill, the mad one. Let me in, he said. I brought something for you. Thorn didn't respond. You're hungry, right? Merrill continued. We're all hungry. A pause. I brought you her hand. Something thumped against the door. A wet sound. Thorn stepped back. The lamb bleated, sensing the wrongness. He did not open the door, and eventually Merrill left, but the smell stayed. At dawn, the bells rang again, not the church bells. Those had melted weeks ago. The sound came from the holes, a low, warbling chime, deep and shaking. Every window in Malowedge cracked. The villagers dropped to their knees. They believed it was a sign. They believed Thorn had summoned it. He hadn't. This was the moor's doing, a tantrum, a god denied its meal. It would not be denied again. By the 5th day, Thorn had changed. He didn't look older, but something in his face had hollowed. His cheeks darkened beneath the eyes, and his voice, when he spoke, rarely sounded distant, like it travelled through water. He fed the lamb, cleaned its tiny hooves, combed bits of straw from its wool. It remained warm and real in his arms. He whispered no words around it, only thoughts. It was the last living thing that didn't speak back. He needed that. He needed something true. And then the villagers stopped pretending. They gathered in the square, not with pitchforks, not with weapons, but with offerings, teeth, bones, hair, pages of burned scripture, rewritten with spirals and circles and symbols that pulsed under torchlight. They stood in a ring. They chanted without speaking. Thorn could feel it. They were summoning the moor, trying to bring it fully into the village, not just in whispers, in flesh. It wanted form, and they were giving it one. Thorn left the house at sunset, the lamb tucked in a blanket against his chest, the knife tucked in his belt. He walked through the village, past wide-eyed neighbours who didn't speak, but bowed. Their mouths were painted shut in ash, their eyes ringed with soot. They didn't stop him. They parted like water, because they still believed he was its voice. He hoped they were wrong. He headed for the hills. The ground was wet beneath his boots, not from rain, from breath. The earth exhaled beneath each step, steaming and pulsing. The spirals had spread, carved into rocks, into trees, into the backs of animals. Some of the holes now had faces, not real ones, but imitations. Carved mouths, slits for eyes, all twisted in mockery of human features. They were masks. The moor was learning, becoming. When Thorn reached the largest hole, the one he had found as a boy, it had changed again, now as wide as a barn, its edges ringed with teeth, not bones, teeth. It wasn't hiding anymore, it was opening. He approached slowly. The lamb trembled in his arms. The hole whispered, "Thorn." He knelt beside it. "I won't speak your name again," he said. "You tricked me." "I was you," it replied. "You were my lie. I was your want, your hunger, your need to be believed. You built me with your mouth. Now I build myself with theirs." "Then why do you need me?" he whispered. The voice was everywhere now. "Because I remember what I was, and I remember who began it." The hole shifted. A shape rose from it. Not a limb. A body. Thorn's body. Younger, perfect, smiling. It opened its mouth and spoke with his voice. "I cried wolf," it said, "and they all came. I cried truth," it continued, "and they still listened. I am Thorn," it finished, "the true one." The lamb screamed, not bleated, screamed like a child. The doppelganger Thorn stepped forward, arms open. "This time, let them see what they've made." thorn acted before he could think. He threw the lamb into the arms of the false thorn. The thing gasped, startled, confused. In that instant, Thorn pulled the knife and lunged, not at the maw, at the hole, at the centre of the spiral. He stabbed downward, into the earth. The blade sank into flesh, real flesh, and the ground screamed. Not the voice, not the whispers, a scream. From everywhere, from everything, the hole buckled inward. The spiral convulsed. The false thorn fell to the ground, twitching, mouth wide in shock. The lamb rolled away, blood on its fur, but alive. The teeth around the hole snapped shut, and silence fell. Thorn did not return to the village. He stayed in the hills. The moor was not dead, but it was wounded. Denying it had been one thing. Hurting it, that was new. He didn't know if it could die, but now he knew it could bleed, and he would make it bleed again, again, and again, until the hills went quiet for good. The first time Elric heard the voice whisper his name from within the fog, he thought it was his guilt speaking. The second time, when it coiled around the syllables like a snake warming in the sun. Elric! He knew something was calling him. He just didn't know if it was from inside the valley or within himself. The villagers had all gone quiet. Silent glances passed in place of words. No one laughed anymore. No one asked him if there were wolves. Instead, they avoided the pastures altogether, even as their flocks diminished. Something was happening up on that ridge, and now no one dared confront it. Even farther, it had been days since their confrontation in the barn. Father hadn't spoken since. He walked differently, lighter somehow, like he was trying to make no sound at all. Sometimes Elric would catch him just standing in the dark at the foot of the stairs, staring up at Elric's door, doing nothing, saying nothing, just staring. Elric didn't know which scared him more, that Father had started seeing what he'd seen, or that he hadn't, and was slipping into madness anyway. That morning, Elric woke with the smell of ash in his nose. The sun was hidden behind a wall of low-hanging smoke. From the hills came a low, continuous groan, like a beast with a broken jaw, forever chewing. Elric didn't ask permission this time. He took his sling and his satchel and climbed into the mist like a boy possessed. The pasture was wrong, not just eerie, wrong. The old stones that lined the sheep paths had moved, not fallen, not crumbled, but moved. Some had been arranged into strange shapes, loops, spirals, one that looked like a yawning mouth. Elric tried not to look too long at that one. He passed by 3 sheep, their wool clumped with moss. They stared at him as he passed, unblinking, utterly still. He wasn't even sure they were alive. At the far ridge, near the elder pine tree, where he used to nap during his shifts, the ground had cracked open. It wasn't large, only about a foot across, but it went deep, deeper than it should. He tossed a pebble in and waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. But a moment later, a breeze rose from the hole, warm and damp. It smelled like rot, like the hollow belly of something dead that still dreamed of hunger. He dropped to one knee beside it, listening. "You brought me stories," a voice cooed, not from above, from below. "Feed me another." Aldrich scrambled back. He turned to run and stopped. There was someone standing at the tree line. Not a man, not quite. Tall, too tall for any shepherd. Its arms hung long and heavy at its sides, fingers grazing the grass. Its head was like that of a wolf, elongated, skull thin, but something was wrong with the proportions. It looked drawn, like someone had tried to sketch a man from memory, but forgot what made it human. It cocked its head at Aldrich, mimicking curiosity. Then it vanished, not into the woods, not into the mist, just gone. Aldrich stood there for a long time, clutching his satchel to his chest, throat tight and burning. He didn't remember getting home. He only realised he was back when he saw his mother's feet. She lay in the doorway of the barn, face down in the hay, arms limp at her sides. Aldrich dropped his bag and ran to her. Her body was warm, too warm, feverish. He shook her, called her name. She gasped. Aldrich jumped back. Her eyes opened, bloodshot and milky, the pupils too wide. She stared at him as if she'd never seen him before. "Did you hear it?" she asked. Aldrich didn't know what she meant, but he didn't want to lie. "Yes," he said. That seemed to calm her. She smiled weakly and closed her eyes again. By nightfall, half the village was ill. No symptoms, no wounds, just a strange, heat-sick fatigue. People wandered the streets like sleepwalkers. The baker's wife stood in the fountain for over an hour, murmuring to herself in a language no one recognised. The mayor was found digging holes in the square, whispering something about mouths beneath the dirt, and always that sound, the moaning hum from the hills, growing louder. It was Father who broke the silence first. "We need to give it something," he said. Aldrich froze. They were sitting at the dinner table. No one had touched their food. Mother sat with her head tilted, as if listening to a sound far away. Father's hands trembled on the table. Something real, not stories, not lies. He looked at Aldrich. Something true, or it'll keep eating. Aldrich felt cold bloom in his chest. "You think this is my fault?" he asked, voice thin. Father shook his head. "I think it heard you first." That night, Aldrich woke from a dream where the sky opened like a mouth and bled stars. He found himself outside, barefoot, walking toward the pasture. He wasn't dreaming. The villagers were walking too, dozens of them, in nightgowns and cloaks, some barefoot, others dragging tools or torches, not speaking, not looking at each other, just moving. They all walked the same path. toward the elder pine, toward the hole. Aldrich followed, trembling. The hole had grown. It was now as wide as a well, its edges wet with a pulsing black ichor. The villagers gathered around it, silently, like congregants awaiting a sermon. Then the mayor stepped forward. Without ceremony, he stepped into the hole and vanished. No scream, no impact, just gone. One by one, others followed. The blacksmith, the baker's wife, the boy from the grain mill, into the hole. The air was thick with silence. Aldrich turned to run and saw his father behind him, not stopping him, not speaking, just watching. The next day, half the village was missing. No one spoke of it, not even Aldrich. He went to the pasture, sat by the pine, watched the mist breathe. The ground trembled beneath him, subtle, like the twitch of a sleeping beast. He felt it under his fingernails, in his bones. The thing in the hills had fed, and it was still hungry. He tried to leave. He packed his satchel, put on his cloak, and made for the east road. But the path was gone, not blocked, gone. The trees were wrong, closer than before, leaning in. Every road out twisted back to the village. No matter which way he walked, even the sun didn't rise right anymore. It hovered in the same place all morning, then blinked to dusk without warning. He was trapped. They all were. That evening, as the village gathered in the square, Aldrich saw something new. A child, no older than 7, sat with her family near the well. She whispered into her sister's ear, and they both laughed, and the fog thickened around them like syrup. Aldrich felt the wind shift. A murmur rolled through the soil. Something was listening. It liked the story she told. It wanted more. Aldrich watched the child with hollow eyes. He understood now. It didn't matter if you lied or told the truth. The more didn't care. It just wanted your voice. That night, as the stars blinked overhead like cold eyes, Aldrich climbed the ridge. He stood beside the yawning hole. It no longer pretended to be anything else. It pulsed like a throat mid-swallow, wet and hungry and vast. He cleared his throat and he told a story about a boy who cried wolf, and the wolf that answered, and the world that forgot the difference between truth and lie. The hole listened, and it smiled. They buried old Martin beneath the crooked elm on the edge of the village, his body found curled like a question mark on the chapel floor, mouth agape, eyes clawed open from the inside. No wound, no blood, no evidence of wolves, just the raw, strange stillness that followed when something had come and taken what it wanted without leaving a trace. They said it was his heart. The doctor from Redfern Hollow claimed he'd died of fear, that age and madness had gotten him, but the villagers knew better. There were claw marks on the floor, deep gouges along the walls of the church tower. They weren't from old Martin. The door hadn't been broken in. It had been opened. By morning, 2 things were clear. First, The howling hadn't stopped. If anything, it had worsened. The sound now came not only from the hills, but from beneath the village itself, scratching through roots, crawling through the earth like worms with teeth. Second, Ellis had vanished. No one had seen the boy since the funeral. His room at the tavern was untouched, the bed made, the window shut. The fire had gone out. A single bowl of porridge, congealed and untouched, sat at the foot of the bed. But they found his shoes on the edge of the moor, facing outward, as if he'd been drawn forward, not running from something, but toward it. Jonan stood over them in the grey light of dawn, his lantern swaying against the weight of wind. The grass around the shoes had grown brittle and white, like the frost that came only in the dying of things. He touched the leather gently, still warm. "He's gone after it," came a voice behind him. Elric, pale, breathless, holding his hat to his chest. "Gone to feed it, just like the shepherd said." Jonan turned. "You saw the moor, didn't you?" Elric hesitated. "Not all of it, just enough." "Then take me." The younger man paled. "No, I'm not going back. I only survived because it was full already. It had fed." "Then take me to where it fed," Jonan growled, "or I'll drag you." Elric looked at the ground for a long moment. The wind carried a low whimper across the heather. Not a wolf, a boy. They left before sunrise, lanterns hooded and breath steaming between them. The moor swallowed sound like a mouth, chewing it down to silence. Grass bent unnaturally with no breeze. Insects lay belly up on the soil, legs twitching even in death. Jonan carried with him two things: his father's knife, blackened from the forge, and the carved wooden pipe that Ellis had once brought him as a boy. He had no hope that it would protect him, but he carried it nonetheless. They passed through the stone circle, the standing stones etched now with fresh markings, lines that pulsed faintly when touched. Elric walked faster. Jonan had to grip his shoulder just to keep up. "We're close," the young man whispered. "You'll feel it." "What?" The ground beneath their feet shifted, like breath, like ribs rising from sleep. Jonan fell to one knee, hand outstretched. The soil was warm and pulsing, as if something vast slept beneath it. Elric grabbed him roughly and yanked him forward. "Don't linger! It wakes faster now." They reached the edge of the hollow, a great sinkhole in the centre of the moor, ringed with stones older than memory. Jonan had thought it would be like a den, some wolf lair hidden in rock, but the truth was worse. This was not a den, this was a throat. The sides of the hollow pulsed with soft movement, like meat flexing under skin. The bottom was dark, bottomless, layered with root-like tendrils that breathed in tandem. Shapes twitched between the folds: fur, antlers, bone, a child's toy, half digested and glistening. A low groan echoed from within. Jonan dropped to a crouch and pressed his fingers to the earth. "This is where Ellis came." Elric nodded. "Did you see him go in?" "No, but I saw what came out after. The sound rose again from the pit, this time like a cough. A tremor rolled up through the soil. Jonan flinched. Something was surfacing. A long, pale limb broke the surface, then another, slender, almost human, but too long, jointed in the wrong places, fingertips ending not in nails, but in split hooves. A face followed, a familiar one, Ellis. His face, smooth and boyish, his smile, the same crooked one he'd given Jonan after carving the little pipe, but the eyes, empty, reflective, silvered with something that was not light. It opened its mouth. A second face pushed out, splitting the jaw. The shepherd, but warped. His skin hung like wet wool, hair matted with brambles, mouth forever open in a smile of too many teeth. Jonan backed away, bile rising in his throat. "What in the saint's name is it?" he whispered. Elric shook his head, trembling. "A mimic, a mask. It wears him now. Where is Ellis? Fed to it, or merged?" Jonan turned back to the moor. The Ellis thing had fully emerged, legs long and shifting, as if it hadn't decided what to be. It stood in the centre of the hollow and opened its arms. From its mouth came a voice that wasn't Ellis's, but it used his words. "Wolf, wolf," it cried, laughing. "There's a wolf in the village." Jonan froze, because behind them, in the far distance, came a reply. Children's voices, high, mirthful, chanting the old rhyme. "Wolf, wolf, there's a wolf." It was spreading. The lie, not just through Ellis, through the whole village. Jonan didn't remember drawing the knife, only the moment he lunged forward, blade catching moonlight as he plunged it into the mimic's chest. It laughed, not in pain, but in joy. "You're early," it whispered, "but I'm still so hungry." The ground broke open. Elric screamed. Hands, dozens of them, clawed out from the soil, dragging him downward. Not dead hands, not rotten, new, made of mud and fur and bone. Jonan turned, blade raised, but they didn't come for him. They only took Elric, smiling as he vanished beneath the ground. The Ellis thing tilted its head. "Only liars can hear me. Only liars feed me. What lie did you believe, Jonan?" He swung. The blade met flesh, but passed through as if through smoke. The mimic's face split open again. Ellis grinned from inside. "I lied about being scared," it said. "You lied about not caring." Jonan fell to his knees, and the moor below began to sing. He woke at the edge of the moor, blood on his lips and soil in his ears. The hollow was gone, sealed, but he knew it wasn't gone, just sleeping, and so was the village. He returned to find Hollowmere hushed. No laughter, no crying, just an endless quiet, like the breath between one lie and the next. Children watched him from windows. Each had silver in their eyes. The tavern was empty. The bells had stopped. Only one thing remained where the stone circle had stood, a small wooden pipe, and beneath it, etched into the earth, the wolf came, and you were too late. The wind had changed. It didn't howl, nor whisper, nor carry the scent of sheep or smoke. It was hollow, as though the valley exhaled something it could no longer contain. Where the hills once hummed with life, crickets, crows, and the distant bleating of flocks, there was only a void now, and in that void something waited. Thomas stood in the centre of the empty pasture. His shoes were soaked with dew and darker things. Every step felt like sinking. Around him lay the remains of broken fences, scattered tufts of wool, and bloodless bones that cracked underfoot. But it wasn't the gore that made him tremble. It was the quiet. Behind him, the village had changed. Fewer lights burned at night. More homes stood empty. The forge was cold. The chapel door swung open and shut in the wind. The bell, long since fallen from its rusted hook. Only smoke from the apothecary still curled upward, faint and reluctant, as though uncertain if it had permission to rise. No one believed him any more, not even the ones who had seen the creature in the hills, mouths gaping in disbelief, eyes wide with that ancient fear that dared not speak. They had retreated behind shuttered windows and whispered prayers, pretending belief was a luxury they couldn't afford. But Thomas knew he had seen it again last night, not from the safety of a tree or the edges of the pasture, but close, so close its breath had fogged his vision. The thing had not been running any more. It had stood tall, too tall for something on four legs, and regarded him with eyes like coals buried in snow. Its mouth, no longer simply a gash, but a rift, had opened wider than its own skull should allow, and from within came not a growl, but a laughter that mimicked his own voice, the same voice he used when he told his first lie. Wolf, wolf, it had screamed in his voice, lips not moving. There's a wolf among us. Thomas had dropped his lantern and fled, scraping his palms on the stone, tripping over the skull of a sheep he'd named Clover just weeks before. Now, dawn bled across the hills, and he was back in the fields, not because he was brave, but because he couldn't sleep, not anymore. Every dream was that gaping mouth. Every sound in his house was the creak of its approach. He'd moved his bed into the cellar and bolted the doors from the inside. He hadn't seen his mother in 3 days. The moor, as he had come to call it, had grown bold. It no longer stayed to the hills or waited for nightfall, and its shape had begun to change. Once it mimicked wolves, then it mimicked voices. Now it mimicked people. Last evening, before the sun dipped, Thomas had seen Jonah walking toward the chapel, the same Jonah who'd been taken 2 weeks before. Nothing left of him but a trail of red thread and a molar stuck in a fence post. But this Jonah had smiled too widely, waved with fingers that bent like reeds, and turned its head all the way around before slipping into the shadows. No one else saw it, or perhaps they pretended not to. Thomas wasn't sure which was worse. The Moor had learned to wear masks, and it was hungry. The knock came at twilight. 3 raps, slow, measured, wood on wood. Thomas had sealed every window in his house, hammered boards across the cellar hatch, lit every candle he could find, and drawn circles in salt around the doors, around his bed, even around his dog, Thistle, who no longer barked, only whimpered, but the knocking persisted, not frantic, not demanding, polite, as though waiting for an invitation. Thistle began to growl, soft at first, then rising in pitch like a scream held in the throat. He pressed himself against Thomas's legs, trembling so violently his nails scratched the stone floor. Then came the voice. "Thomas, let me in." It was his mother's voice, gentle, warm, cracking just slightly, as though she'd been weeping. "I'm cold, sweetheart. I've been outside so long. You forgot to come check on me." Thomas backed into the farthest corner of the cellar. He didn't speak. A pause. Then her voice again, lower now, less human. "Don't be afraid. I know I look strange, but it's still me. I brought you supper." Thistle barked. A single snap of defiance, then silence. Thomas held his breath. The thing behind the door sighed. The door creaked open, despite the bolts, despite the boards. Not from force, but from inevitability, as though locks meant nothing to it anymore. And then it entered, but it was not his mother. It wore her face like a mask too tight. Her skin hung loose around the jaw. Her eyes were too still, and her voice. "Wolf!" it rasped. "There's a wolf among us." It lunged. Thomas threw the lantern. Flames burst across the cellar wall, lighting the creature's shadow as it twisted and recoiled, shrieking in fury. The salt circles held, just barely, flaring like embers where its feet crossed them. The thing shrank back, twitching, writhing, its many teeth chattering as though cold. And then it laughed. The laugh wasn't human. It was all the voices Thomas had ever used, every lie he'd told, every false alarm, every trick echoed back at him in chorus. Then it whispered, "You made me real," and vanished. When Thomas came to, the sun was bleeding into the hills. The cellar door was intact. Thistle lay curled by the stairs, unharmed, but staring at nothing. The village was awake again, but not in the way Thomas remembered. They were celebrating. Banners hung across doors. The chapel bell rang for the first time in weeks. Children danced in the square. Bread was passed. Mead was shared. Even the priest smiled, his mouth far too wide. Thomas wandered among them, unacknowledged, unseen. He passed Jonah, who did not blink. He passed his mother, who waved too slowly. He passed the mayor, whose throat still bore the scar from where the Moor had kissed it. And all around him the villagers chanted, "Wolf! Wolf! There's a wolf among us!" Only now it wasn't a warning. It It was a greeting. In the hills above, the pasture was lush again. Sheep grazed as though nothing had ever happened. The fences had mended, the trees were heavy with fruit, and in the very centre of the field stood a boy, Thomas, or what wore his shape. It held a shepherd's crook in one hand, and the other hand cupped beside its mouth, ready to shout, but it didn't, not yet. Its mouth curled into a grin, too wide for its face, and below it, deep in the roots of the hill, something ancient and black, with too many mouths stirred, fed by the weight of belief, the echoes of lies, and the silence of those who knew better. The path back to the village was no longer one Thomas could follow with certainty. It twisted through the same slopes and pines as always, but something had shifted. The trees leaned too close, their shadows not tied to sun or moon, but to something older, deeper. Even the wind had gone silent, replaced by the hush of breath, slow and measured, like something watching from beneath the roots. Thomas held Ada tightly, her face pale and still in his arms, her breath weak but steady. Blood seeped through the cloth wrapped around her leg, trailing behind him like a red thread through the frost-bitten ferns. His own shoulder burned where the moor had grazed him, the wound pulsing to a rhythm not his own. He dared not look back. He knew it would be there, the great mouth in the hills, licking the snow clean of the blood it had tasted. When the flickering torchlight of the village came into view, Thomas collapsed in the dirt at its edge. Several figures ran toward him, shouting his name, shouting Ada's. He couldn't make out the words. His eyes locked on one thing only, old Garrett's face in the crowd, gaunt and haunted and afraid. Afraid of him, Ada awoke a week later, her legs stitched and bound, her eyes sunken and grey. "Do you remember anything?" Thomas whispered. She blinked slowly. It smiled. It had too many teeth, and it sounded like your voice. Thomas clenched his jaw. The elders had forbidden him from speaking to the village about what he saw. Mass hysteria, they said. The snow plays tricks on the weak-minded. They buried 2 more shepherds who'd gone missing days after Thomas returned. No wolves, no signs of struggle, just hollow, red-stained clothing on the wind. Every time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw the pit in the hills open, saw the way it breathed through the earth, saw its tongue darting between stones, a hunger old and nameless, and he heard his own voice echoing from it still. That winter, the sheep refused to graze in the hills. Dogs whimpered and urinated themselves when brought near the base. The children whispered of eyes in the snow and shapes crawling in the fog. One boy claimed he saw a man in the forest, dragging a wolf's pelt behind him, walking backward on all fours. They found that boy weeks later, his mouth packed with soil, his hands torn from digging. Thomas no longer visited the forest edge. he stopped working the flock. People whispered he had grown strange. At night, he wandered the snow barefoot, staring at the mountain like he was listening to something. Sometimes he laughed, loud, echoing laughs, just like the cries he used to make when playing at danger. Except now he wasn't playing. One night, during a village council meeting, the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a pulse, a long, low thump, like a giant's heartbeat. Snow slid from the rooftops, glass cracked, chickens screamed. Then came the smell, rot, wet fur, charred teeth, and something else, something sweet and sticky, like jam left too long in the sun. Thomas stood from the edge of the meeting, his head tilted to the side, eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. "It's hungry again," he said. He walked into the night. No one stopped him. That spring, the hills were green and the air warm. The moor did not open again, not visibly, but the sheep births came stillborn. The milk soured, children were born without tongues or eyes, and the cries began again. Every few nights, someone would hear it, a boy's voice calling wolf, wolf, from the edge of the forest, sometimes from the cliffs, sometimes from beneath their own floorboards. The first family to ignore it vanished entirely. Years passed. The villagers became quiet, superstitious folk. They no longer spoke of Thomas. Newcomers were not told the tale. The hill paths were closed. At night, the forest was watched with torches and salt circles. But it did not stop the voice. It came from everywhere now. It changed too. Sometimes younger, sometimes older, sometimes it came as Thomas, sometimes as Ada, once, chillingly, as Elder Garrett's dead wife. Wolf, wolf, wolf. The children learned to never answer it. The ones who did were found staring blankly into the dark, lips moving silently, eyes pitch black. In time, people came to know the hills, not as pasture, but as warning. Something had been awakened in the cries of a boy who lied too many times. Something hungry, something with patience. The moor had no need to open wide anymore. It had learned something from Thomas, something about voices, about mimicry, about trust. It could whisper now, could take its time. On the edge of the forest, if you stand alone and still, you might hear a voice. Sometimes it's laughter, sometimes it's sobbing, but often it's just a boy, his voice clear, sweet and desperate. "Please, help me. There's a wolf. If you answer, you will never return the same. You may return at all, but what's wearing your skin won't understand why people recoil when you smile, why the dog won't stop barking at you, why your shadow no longer matches your limbs, and why deep in the night you hunger for the hill, you hunger for them, you hunger for more."